I'm Anuradha Choudry and I work in Bangalore, but home is Pondicherry. My father heard of the Sri Aurobindo ashram in Pondicherry, and since he was in the army and we were traveling all the time, it was easier for us to be in one place and study. The Sri Aurobindo ashram has a fantastic system of education based on the integral yoga philosophy. So that's how I found myself there in that school, and I grew up in paradise. So I'm presently associated with the Center for Indian Psychology at the Jain University in Bangalore, where my colleague Dr. Vinay Chandra and I are both looking at alternative approaches to psychology based on the Indian tradition. This tradition is largely based on the yogic traditions as well. So what we are trying to do is to provide an alternative approach to the existing paradigms of psychology. It's very important to recognize the fact that every system of psychology is based on a certain worldview. The dominant mainstream psychology that is taught at all universities across the globe has been inspired or has emerged, has evolved. The mainstream psychology, the dominant field which is taught in all universities, has evolved from the Western understanding of the world, and all the experiments, etc., have come from that part, which has a certain understanding of human nature, of goals of human life, etc. In India, we've had a very different starting point in understanding human nature, in understanding what are the objectives of a human lifetime, and what are the influences that determine how an individual finally behaves, or what happens to an individual within themselves. So the Indian psychology is basically drawing on these alternative worldviews which evolve out of the Indian tradition. And it's a movement that started about a decade or so ago, where a lot of psychologists, eminent psychologists in India got together and said that the present understanding of human nature as depicted by mainstream psychology seems to represent a rather narrow band on the spectrum of human consciousness. And so what we are trying to bring into the picture is the fact that human nature has much more below as well as above, which is not abnormal or parapsychology, comes very much within the domain of normal psychology if one chooses to stretch one's boundaries. So with Indian psychology, we are trying to stretch the boundaries of human capacities and potentials so that eventually we can arrive at a greater degree of freedom and mastery based on how the yoga tradition understands the basis of human nature. Normally, I think that to know whether a practice is working or not, it can be understood by the degree of one's simplicity, the degree of one's happiness. And I think the study of Sanskrit always makes me happy. Every time I talk of Sanskrit or I have to think something about Sanskrit, it fills me with a sense of wonderment about what this language can do. And because the very nature of the language is its directness, the directness of its experience, I think I have discovered a lot of inner insights by using this language. The sounds of this language have acted as guides, and I think they've allowed me to touch some truths which have been quite freeing for me. So I think that Sanskrit in itself has been very helpful in making sure that I'm a happier and I hope a more simple person. But I must also say that my practice is not only Sanskrit. I have been working, or I have grown up in the philosophy of the integral yoga, which says that all life is yoga. And therefore, any action, any thought, everything can become a tool, a useful tool to help us develop another degree of self-awareness. So I think it's the integral yoga and the Sanskrit which keep me a happier person. So the very characteristic of the Sanskrit language is its transparency. It is a language which is transparent at all the levels of its expression, starting from its sound, its writing, its words, its grammatical structure. There is a certain direct, or there is a certain transparency that permeates this language. And I think that my study of Sanskrit somewhere has helped to restructure my system towards a quest for truth. And I think that is quite powerful in terms of how a language can also act as a form of yoga. When I was completing my studies and I chose to do Sanskrit, everybody asked me the question, why Sanskrit? Because apparently there was not much of a future in it. People thought that I would end up as a simple teacher somewhere, or there wasn't much scope. But there were two things that inspired me to keep going. One was a quotation by Sri Aurobindo on the Vedas, where he says that the recovery of the perfect truth of the Vedas is not merely a desideratum of modern intellectual curiosity, but a practical necessity for the future of the human race. And in another quotation, he ends the quote where he says, I seek not science, I seek not theosophy, I seek not blind superstitions, I seek the Vedas, knowing which everything here is known. So I told myself it would be intelligent to just go straight to the point, knowing which everything would be known, instead of beating about the bush. So I realized that in order to study the Vedas further, I would have to study Sanskrit. And another verse from a text called the Panchatantra gave me the strength to go ahead with it. Because when we look at our future ahead, an important aspect is the financial security. So this particular verse goes like this. I'll say the Sanskrit and then I'll translate it for you. So it says, Praptavyam artham labhate manushyaha. The money that a person has to get, or the wealth a person has to get, will be got by that person. Devo pitam langhayitum na shaktaha. Even the gods cannot change that. Tasmat na shochami na vismayo me. And that's why I am not worried, nor am I at wonder about anything. Yadasmadiyam nahitat paresham. What has to be mine will not be anybody else's. So I said, instead of trying to do something and chase money, I might as well do what I love. If money has to come, it will come anyway. Sanskrit was what I chose to pursue. So my work with Sanskrit has taken me to many places. But during these travels, I have also been sharing some work with mantras, with the power of sound, connecting it to Sanskrit, but independently just with what sounds do to us. And in this context, I have traveled to quite a few places in Europe as well as in the US. What I find always very heartwarming is the fact that there are many aspiring souls in all these places I have been. And ultimately, it doesn't really matter which culture one comes from, because people are there trying to understand themselves and are happy to use any tool. Some come to the yogic tradition, some are there with Qigong, or there are so many different ways of approaching this truth, which ties into the Vedic idea again that there is one truth and there are many, many paths. So I have found that true in my interaction with different yoga practitioners and different aspiring yogis across the globe. And it's always feels like home wherever I am.